we looked at the 55-6. This is the place where we're going to have a mutation in the emotional system, in which the emotional awareness is going to begin to emerge as a genetic mutation in children that will be born in that time, beginning around 2027. We're going to have a cycle change. Mutation is always going to take place in individuality. Yet the fact that mutation exists in individuality and exists in that sense in all individual aspects, it does not mean that they are transferable as a mutation to society as a whole. I mean, the ultimate goal of the mutative process is to find a mutation so valuable that it's to the benefit of the entire genetic pool. That's what mutation is all about, and that's why we have so much mutative potential in order to get to the point where we have valuable, effective mutations. In order for that mutation to take hold, it will not take hold in the collective. In other words, it will not take hold by the individual being able to mutate directly the collective. Whenever individuals mutate the collective, you end up with tension and friction with the tribe. But remember the nature of the tribe. The tribe has an inherent recognition of stagnation in the genetic pool. You know, the farmer's daughter's story. That the stranger can be taken into the tribe because it's necessary to refresh the genetic pool. What that literally means is that in order for mutation to have an impact on the totality, on the global genetic pool, it has to be able to mutate the tribe first, and we have this 55-6 moving to the 37, the gate of the family, the gate of bargains and contracts, the gate of friendship. The awareness, that is in the emotional sense, the clarity, who will or will not provide what is needed. You know, the 4037, the channel of community, is one of the most common of all definitions because it is an opposition that forms a channel. And that the channel of community, that through community we have our basic bonds that are structured in order that family and education and work can be incorporated into the community life. The 37th gate, as an emotional gate, is there to attract the ego out of its rest and into work. That's why I spoke to you the other day about the differences between the 58-1 smile and the 37 smile. That 37 smile says that for the affection I can give you, I'm going to get you to work for me, okay? Because that's the bargain. You know, this is the place where the marriage contract is written. You know, I take out the garbage, you do the dishes. And it's essential to understand that what we glorify as friendship is an arrangement. And when we accept that our communities are built from the family outward on arrangements that are clear, we're going to have more stable communities. Marriage is so often confused with love. And of course it has everything and nothing to do with love. After all, my definition of love is my definition of geometry. You know, if there's somebody in your face every day, that's love. It says above the line in the 37, the manifestation macro and microcosmically of the organic nature of communities. This macro-micro, in looking at the nature of circuitry in the body graph, as I've mentioned to you, that there are many, many different circuits. It's not simply a question of the 6 general circuits that we use on the surface for understanding our relationships to other things. And of course, in the mystical circuitry, which runs from the 19 through to the 49, through the 4037, and then on to the 5125 and the 2010, that mystical stream, that mystical circuit, that the only channel of those 4 channels that is not mystical by definition is the 4037. And yet the 4037 is essential for what we call religious or spiritual practices, because this is the community of faith. And it is the 37 at the mystical level that is always looking for the hand of God and always crawling out to be touched. You know, when I first had my experience with the voice, I was surrounded by sannyasins. And so they turned out to be some of the first people that had charts done. And I kept on seeing this 4037. You know, I even gave it I called it the sannyasin line, the sannyasin hook, because I could see that they were all carrying this same vibration. It's because of 37 and the 40, this is the searching for spirituality, mysticism, faith. It's very similar to the 1156 in that there is not necessarily finding here. This is a seeking process, and particularly in the 37. Remember that the 40th gate at the other end is a gate of denial. So think about the lower trigram here in the 37. The lower trigram only has personal, inward-oriented perception. It does not know that there's a harmonic gate at the other end of the channel, which means that even though this is an inherently social channel, that they're not really well equipped to be social. You know, the 37-1 is trying to figure out what the value of community really is and what's the best bargain I can make with an ego. It isn't necessarily social. This is the right angle cross of planning. That is the 37, the 40, the 9, and the 16. And this is the global cycle in terms of the precession of the equinox that we're in now. And this first line is the theme that is operating as a general theme globally. And it's been operating that way since 1961 and will last until 2027 when we go into the shift and we go to the 55 and the 6th line. So here is the theme that we're in now. This is the theme of Mother-Father. It says a position of inherent respect that ensures a focus for the development of guidelines. Now, by the way, the Rei Vi Ching obviously was written after 1961. Prior to 1961, this line only referred to the father. You know, we live in a time where there is a rebalancing between the yang and the yin forces on the planet. And that theme, that respect is something that is not gender conditioned or oriented, is a theme that has begun to flourish through this line since 1961. Venus exalted, harmony is the key to the successful maintenance of relationships. It is only through harmony that the beauty and the values of the family can endure, and there's no planet in detriment. Friendship that is rooted in sensitivity and ensures harmony. Now the key here is sensitivity and the understanding that this is a gate of touch. Everything having to do with this stream of sensitivity is related to touch. And it's one of the things to recognize that when you meet a 37, be prepared to be hugged. Because they do that, and they do that rather well. Be prepared to be kissed, because they do that rather well. That's their business. Now they have to be sensitive enough to know when to do that and how much of that to do, after all. It's all a bargain. That gift of being open emotionally and taking somebody in, it's very important, obviously. It is the necessary emotional energy to ensure the stability of community. However, one should see very clearly that the sensitivity necessary is the sensitivity to the ego at the other end in the 40th gate, which is the gate of denial. You know, 4037s have a hard time because they wake up in the morning, the emotional egos that they are, they wake up in the morning and they say, I know there's God and God is coming And they go to bed at night and wake up the next morning and they say, God's full of shit and there's no God. And it's quite a dilemma for them to go between the two of them all the time. Back and forth, you know. I mean, this is one of the things to understand about the nature of not knowing. If you don't know, there is always doubt or confusion. If you don't know, there is always the movement between hope and denial. Because you don't know. That's why mutation is so important. Mutation brings knowing. The second line. It says responsibility, but we know very well that the 37.2, because of the structure of second lines, is not likely to be taking responsibility for anything other than itself. It doesn't really know that it has the capacity to take responsibility in that sense. It has to be recognized by others. But after all, second lines don't like to be distracted. You know, they're going about their business and all of a sudden somebody says they have to be responsible for their brother, their sister, their mother, their father, or whatever. And remember that in the nature of second lines, that when they get pulled out, it isn't necessarily a success, which is why that all second lines should be properly prepared. In other words, that when you see a second line in somebody's design, you know this is a place for education, so that they can be prepared for what other people will see in them. Jupiter exalted, the understanding of the principle of individual responsibility is the foundation for successful cooperation. Don't make me responsible for you. I'm already responsible for myself. How come you're not responsible for yourself? The lament of the 37.2. Why do I have to be responsible for that person? I'm responsible for myself. The possibility of friendship through individual responsibility. So if you make no demands on the 37.2, you can have your relationship with them. The detriment, Mercury in detriment, a tendency to point out the responsibility of others. It's the same thing. You know, you go knocking on their window because you see that they can be responsible and they're being responsible for themselves naturally, ignorantly as a matter of fact. And then you knock on that window and you tell them that, you know, they have to do this or that, and they say, well, look, you should be looking after that, and you should be looking after that, and you should be looking after that, and they do that with a smile. The possibility that friendship will lead to pointing out the responsibilities of others. So if you wake up this second line, you know, you're going to get it all the time. These two that form the base of this hexagram, this first binary, they really give you the essence of the nature of successful family, that is, respect and individual responsibility. Only out of that can come a cooperative lifestyle. And at the moment that there isn't respect or responsibility, then you're going to have all kinds of dilemmas that are going to arise out of that. They have to be inherent in the bargain. Otherwise, you have dependencies. The detriment, Mercury in detriment, a tendency to point out the responsibility of others. It's the same thing. You know, you go knocking on their window because you see that they can be responsible and they're being responsible for themselves naturally, ignorantly as a matter of fact. And then you knock on that window and you tell them that, you know, they have to do this or that, and they say, well, look, you should be looking after that, and you should be looking after that, and you should be looking after that, and they do that with a smile. The possibility that friendship will lead to pointing out the responsibilities of others. So if you wake up this second line, you know, you're going to get it all the time. These two that form the base of this hexagram, this first binary, they really give you the essence of the nature of successful family, that is, respect and individual responsibility. Only out of that can come a cooperative lifestyle. And that the moment that there isn't respect or responsibility, then you're going to have all kinds of dilemmas that are going to arise out of that. They have to be inherent in the bargain. Otherwise, you have dependencies. The third line. Third lines, their structural theme is adaptation. They go through their process of trial and error. And here, they're in a very good place. This is an opportune place for the third line in the 37. Through trial and error, after all, again, they do not know there's a 40 at the other end. Imagine what that's like. You've got the 37 and you don't know there's a 40. You know, you don't know that when you go out there with your smile that you can meet denial. I don't need you. I don't need your affection. You're not going to leave me alone. I'm going to have to work all the time. You know, I'm going to have to get a mortgage and build a house and educate kids. And are you crazy? You know, they don't know that there's a 40 there. You know, they don't know that when they're the 37 Jehovah's Witness and they knock on the door of the 40 atheists, what they're going to get. They have no idea. They're stunned. People are really like that? So, you know, pay attention to your lower trigram lines and recognize what that means for you. You know, that there's always that surprise out there. Now, we know that the third line, because it is designed to bang into things, develops very quickly the experience that says, I'm meeting things on the other end. Even-handedness. The success of any group is dependent on maintaining order. Jupiter exalted, the ability to judge what behavior is appropriate and to react in a balanced manner to transgressions. The possibility to have the sensitivity to know what behavior, what behavior is appropriate in a relationship. Now that possibility comes out of the experience. Remember, this third line is an introduction line. That is, there's an introduction before you get to the exalted, which means genetically that it opens up over the life curve rather than something that is active immediately. So there's a learning process inherent in this. You keep on banging into others, you may figure it out. You know, you may figure out who for you can have the right bargain with. Remember, that's what the 37 is looking for. See, the tribe is deeply dependent on the ego. You know, it is stuck with the sacral, and as a result, it has to work on the material plane to produce all the things that we call community. And all of that has to be funneled through the ego because it's the ego that has to do the work. You know, why do you think religions are full of this willpower stuff? Because the ego is the place of will. And nothing gets done without that will. So the 37 is there to try to get to the next stage in the tribal process, is to catch the ego. It's essential. Because only the ego, with its willpower, can fulfill the material possibilities of the tribe. Mars in detriment. An ironic tendency in either to either test incessantly the borders of acceptability or to respond to the very same tendency in others with severity. That is, a possible lack of sensitivity to what behavior is appropriate. You know, they don't know how to do it, and they learn through trial and error. And by the way, if you think this detriment is a problem, you know, this is not, again, not about morality. The 37-3 can only enter into possible bargains based on being its own nature. You know, to live out your definition and to live out your type and your authority. If you go into a bargain as yourself and you're this third line in detriment, The fact that you've gone in as yourself simply means that it's the behavior of the other that will not be correct for you, and there's nothing wrong with your behavior, even though they don't like it. After all, you're here to find the ego that has the right bargain, that you can share, that you can support. So it's not about whether, it sounds pretty or not, or it sounds nice or not. And it's so important for the third line. There is no discovery possible. There's no discovery possible unless there is a trial and error process, unless somebody's out there making mistakes. Mistakes are part of the learning curve for all third lines. Now, of course, what really messes them up is that if they don't enter into things themselves, if they don't enter into relationships themselves, it is the not self that has to deal with all the mistakes. And what they're trying to fix through their interrelationships have nothing to do with them. And of course, they can become a mess. We're talking about an emotional gate that's operating in the emotional wave from hope to pain. That 37, that smile can disappear so fast. After all, don't forget the duality inherent in all these things. That family can be anti-family. The skills of friendship are very different in the upper trigram. Obviously, we have a change here because we now have a transpersonal capacity. That is that the 37th gate here in the fourth line knows that there's a 40th gate at the other end. It knows that there's an ego there, which means that it knows the ego in terms of its power and rest equation. And it knows that the ego will deny. It just knows that because it's at the other end. It has different skills. Remember, what always happens to the fourth line is that it tends to overcompensate to the friendship side. In other words, because it's the first line that recognizes the other, it tends to focus most of its energy on the other. That's why you get a lot of detriments that say, you're getting overwhelmed, you lose your identity, the harmony becomes more important than anything else. This is typical of the fourth line, because it is recognizing the other and trying to accommodate it in order to be able to externalize its nature. The gift of any fourth line, like the fifth line, both of them are deeply involved with timing. The fourth line is opportunism. And remember that the nature of opportunity is that you must wait and stay with what you have until you can jump. So instead of spending all of your energy on trying to develop all kinds of relationships and maintain them for that opportunity, it's better to recognize which friendships are really going to be fruitful and to wait for them. Leadership by example. Remember the power of influence of the fourth line because it is fixed. It's missionary quality. Any member of the family may take on a leading role through exemplary behavior. The moon exalted the manifestation of the highest principles in everyday and practical affairs. Geez, that sounds nice. The possibility, always conditions it better, the possibility of the highest principles in all relationships resulting in a leadership role. Here is the gift to be able to externalize friendship. You've got a line that is inherently friendly in a gate that's all about friendship. So they're real smoothies. They know exactly how to befriend you. That does not mean that they're going to make a bargain with you. What's important to them is that they make friends with you. The bargain may or may not come later. Remember the nature of a fourth line, that a fourth line makes friends with you so that ultimately it can fuck you. Remember that. Now that can be good or bad. You can enjoy it or not. You can gain or be ripped off. They can be very kind and very mean. It's just the nature of the line. So it's one of those things to recognize, is that when the 37-4 smoothie comes up to you and makes friends, A, it doesn't mean you got a bargain. B, you better be careful in the contracts. You have to be very clear. Now, of course, the moment I make a joke like that, I can hear your heads grinding. Which 37-4s do I know? And the 37-4 that's a real smoothie is the 37-4 that is themselves. And if that is their gift, that really is their gift of building the community. These are the people that, can pull strangers off the street to make ridiculous donations for their church or whatever the case may be. You don't have a gift of befriending people and then creating a bargain out of that. Now, that can be good and that can be bad. It's like anything. But that's their gift. Saturn in detriment, a conservatism that generally only accepts the leadership of the father, who may or may not be a valued role model. That is, the possibility of being insensitive to the leadership of anyone other than those accepted by tradition. They themselves have to be leaders. And of course, the moment that they get into a situation in which there is somebody in power who they don't feel has the right to be in power, they're very good at creating a revolution. Remember the 49-4, the gate of revolution, the fourth line is platform. They're very, very good at creating a revolution. Using their gift of friendship in a Machiavellian way. Which again can be very useful. When you get to the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds of this line, you have a change in the cross. And the 16 and the 9 is replaced by the 35 and the 5. So you have the 37, the 40, the 5, and the 35, and this is the juxtaposition cross of bargains. It's about as great a place for a negotiator as you can imagine. Given what a juxtaposition cross, which is that it's neither left nor right, it's neither this nor that there is a capacity in it to be able to act as a mediator. And one of the things you'll find if you meet these people is that you'll see that everything is a negotiation and everything is a bargain for them. This whole business of the 40-37 is about the tension in a word that we use a lot and that we give a great deal of importance to, which is the word trust. Trust is something that is broken here. The 37 wants to trust that the 40 will be loyal. And the 40 wants to trust. It wants to trust that the 37 will be loyal to the bargain. So there's a lot of broken trust here. There's a lot of broken promises here. Only the ego can make promises. There's a lot of broken promises here. The inherent failure in most communal relationships is deceit. The fact is that the moment that you're not clear in your bargain, anything you do outside of that bargain, you hide. And it's always found. And it always leads to problems. The left angle cross is the left angle cross of migration. Now, this left angle cross of migration is the result of mutation in that sense. In other words, it is a changing of the community through changing the environment. And of course, it's one of the things that human beings do. And when this line theme was in effect, was the beginning of our industrial age. The 37.5 is an unusual line. It is the only one of the 384 that's called love. And it is the only gate, the only line that speaks specifically of hatred, as opposed to self-hatred. Hitler had this, had the 37.5, with the Mars in detriment, in an undefined emotional system. Love, natural and unaffected devotion to the family. Now, you will notice, of course, that that's an introduction line. That is, it isn't something that you get from the beginning. It's something that you learn, that you grow to see. And the way in which you're going to grow to see that is going to be totally dependent on the emotional wave that's operating through that 37. You're always going up and you're always going down. And the emotional system is the fear of nervousness, and that nervousness infuses everything. The nervousness that they will not be friends with you, the nervousness that they are, the hope that that may bring, the despair that that may bring at any given moment in the movement of that wave. Venus exalted natural harmony and perfected sharing. Natural harmony and sharing possible through friendship. Now remember the nature of the fifth line. The fifth line is the heretic general. That is only of value when it's projected on by the rest of the family, and that projection builds so that in times of crisis, that the fifth line can be called upon to take control with its practical solutions. In other words, the fifth line here has to be very, very careful about when to engage in friendship. That friendship is only necessary, that family and community is only necessary in times of crisis. Now think about the way we've looked at the general. You know, I've had this joke where the general's out there on the farm. You know, this is the case in which the general has to be able to come into the city, behind the city walls, in order to seek protection. In other words, to come into the community in times of crisis, but otherwise to stay away from it, because they have no power then. Because the longer you know this fifth line, the more holes you find in your projection about it. Think about the nature of the hexagram as a whole. The basis of any hexagram can be discovered in its first line of introspection. That is the foundation of the hexagram. The mother-father is the foundation of family. But how society wants to see family, how they want to see the 37th gate, is in this fifth line. They want to see it as love. But you see, love in the wave becomes hate, because they're the same. Mars in detriment, emotional dependency that often it's conditioned, turns love into hatred. Think about what that's like. It's emotional dependency. Imagine you're somebody, you've got a defined solar plex system, you have the 37th gate, you have the fifth line. And you meet somebody. They have the 40th gate. You're in a good end of your wave, you feel very, very good to them. And remember that the 5 naturally makes friendships in times of crisis. And so they come into your aura and they feel terrific. And if you do not have a defined emotional system, the defined solar plex is full of sexuality and pleasure. And it's like something that you want to hold on to and keep because it can make you feel good. Only to discover that the 37.5 is emotional and will go down in its wave. Through this line, this creates resentment. The other person in the bargain selfishly bargains for only the love. And when the other side comes, automatically responds with hatred. You made me happy, now you're making me feel terrible. Now you would think that if you're carrying that line, that you have a problem, and it's not true. It's going to be your responsibility to be very clear in your bargain with the other. All emotional people have to make that bargain with the other that's important to them, the other that's going to be in their life. To respect their emotional nature. To not get caught in its emotional conditioning wave. Don't try to bring them up when they're down. Don't try to push them down when they're up. Remember that fifth lines are always about projection, so it's not about the emotional system in that fifth line of that being. It's how everybody that they meet reacts to it. Because they expect love. If you want to have a love-hate meter and see it, you'll see it best in families. You know? You love your father, you hate your father. You love your mother, you hate your mother. You love your brother, you hate your sister. You know, no. Goes on for a lifetime. The sixth line. When we get to the sixth line, we get to the end of the process. Remember that the sixth line is going to go through its third line phase. It's going to go through its trial and error phase. In the first approximate 20 years of its life, it's going to burn its fingers, and then it's going to withdraw, and it's going to climb up to the roof of the house, and it's going to stay out of things. Aloofness, the recluse. And yet always the capacity to be the administrator and to be wisdom from that perspective. The 37.6, like the 46, they are the font that you need if you seek out and want to know knowledge and have information about communities and families, because of course they sit up on the roof of the house and they watch their family have a picnic down below, and they recognize everything that's wrong in all of that. Purpose. The energy to maintain the family is enhanced by recognizing its values. Again, it takes time. You see, the real values of the family cannot be discovered until one, quite literally, is a grandparent. So there's a real joke in all of that. You know, what it's really saying to you is that the values of the family, because the family is the language we use to describe our genetic imperative anyway, is a long-term eternal process, and to really grasp its values is going to take you time. Communities take time to build. I mean, no nation knows that better than America. What it takes to build a community from scratch. Something that's been done over and over and over again here. This left-angle cross of migration. The possibility of extending friendships through the appreciation of its values. You know, the sixth line is sitting up there, and it's not committed to any community. It's not committed to any bargain. You know, it's sort of like being Ralph Nader. That's an old joke. You go up there and you ask them whether the price of the product is right, and they say, yes, it's a fair bargain, or not. You know, they become very good critics of the bargain. I mean, in order for a 37.6 to actually make a commitment to friendship, to really make the commitment to friendship, it has to be able to see clearly the whole perspective of the tribal circuitry. Remember that 6 lines are very different from the 4 and the 5. The 4 and the 5 are transpersonal in the sense they recognize the gate at the other end, the harmonic gate in the channel. And so they are equipped to deal with the other. But the perspective from the roof of the house is greater for the 6th line. It has this perspective that reaches out and sees the whole circuit. And the whole circuit ends up in the 45, and it ends up with what do I have and what do I don't have. And part of that having has to be all of the concerns that are part of the tribe. It's just not enough to make the bargain. You have to see that the bargain is going to manifest, and it's going to manifest so that it brings value in return. Mercury in detriment, a need for diversity that may ignore the achievements of the family in favor of withdrawal. And that is the need for diversity that, despite appreciation, will prefer casual friendships. By the way, these are children that often try to run away from home. I mean, they're just, they see what's going on around them in terms of the bargains that are being made, and they see that life is very unfair to them. They see that the bargains are unjust. And of course, all children suffer from unjust bargains. In most places in the world, they are still chattel. No purpose is served unless the bargain is correct. And that means that the players in the game have to be open and fair in their dealings. If you go into relationships as yourself, that is always going to be the case for you. For you. That doesn't mean the bargain will work. It depends on the nature of your partner and their awareness. So at this place where it's possible to see what bargains bring purpose to the community, or a value to the community, in the wheel where we move is to the logic process, to the collective and its doubts. Now this movement of the last 3 hexagrams, the 55 and its deep mutative capacity, the 37, in a sense to bring the mutation into the bargain, to bring it into the tribe, and then the collective being affected, and the collective instantly beginning with doubt. Because this is the logic system, and this is what is absolutely correct for the logic system. That is, that all understanding must be conditioned by doubt as an inspiration.